I looked up at the two men. So what do I do now? You need to get home right away so you can pack a bag. Then get down to Washington National right away. We're going to send you to Oak Ridge. Your reservations have already been made, the director said. The first flight available is a Southwest flight to Nashville at noon. We'll have somebody meet you at the airport and drive you to Oak Ridge. While I try to take that in, the director added, be sure to leave Ginny a note so she won't be suspicious in case Amir gets in touch with her again. When I got home to our little bungalow and went inside to pack, everything seemed changed. All the furniture and decor that had been cozy and familiar when I woke up now seemed foreign to me. Our home had been full of dreams and aspirations for me. Now none of those remained. When I wrote my note to Ginny, it took everything in my power not to say the things that were in my heart. But I remembered what I'd been told about her lover, and the last thing I wanted to do was to alert him that we were on to him. So I kept my message simple and direct, and I didn't make any dramatic gesture like leaving my wedding ring on top of it. But I did take my ring off and slip it into my pocket. The bond it symbolized was broken beyond repair the moment I heard that recording. During the 2-hour flight, I tried to divert myself with the Sudoku in the in-flight magazine, but I just couldn't concentrate. My hand kept slipping into my pocket to finger the ring lying there. If only it were a magic ring I could use to go back in time before all this started. But then I remembered that whatever urge or vulnerability that had led Ginny into infidelity would still be there, ready to arise when the opportunity came. Damn, I was so up that I couldn't even generate a decent fantasy. As I came off the jet bridge at Nashville International, a very large man with a prominent bulge under his sports coat sidled up to me and asked, "You Thomas Selfridge?" I started to answer, but realized that I didn't know who this guy was. "Do you have any identification?" I asked. He sighed, pulled out his wallet, and flipped open an FBI badge. I nodded and fell in beside him. "How did you know it was me?" I asked. "They told me to look for the saddest-looking guy on the plane," he said without even a smile. I fell in beside him, depressed to think that my misery was obvious to everyone. I didn't catch your name on your badge," I said, trying to be a little sociable. "Henry," he said as he walked on down the concourse. Is Henry your first name or last?" I asked, hurrying to catch up. "Yep," he said, still walking. I shook my head. Between my melancholy and Henry's taciturnity, the drive to Oak Ridge ought to be a barrel of laughs, I thought dejectedly. I'd checked the Google map in the airport before I'd left, and I knew Oak Ridge was slightly over 150 miles almost due east from Nashville on I-40. That meant we had a 2-hour drive ahead of us. As I'd expected, Henry kept his silence for most of the way. But when we passed the exit to Harriman, he unexpectedly nudged me and nodded out toward the left. I glanced up and did a double take. There, poking up through the low ridges and trees, were 2 of the largest smokestacks I'd ever seen. Even with the winter afternoon shadows darkening the surrounding area, the towers were still tall enough to catch the light. The view was surreal, almost like something from a de Chirico painting. "What is it?" I asked. "Kingston Steam Plant," Henry said. "It generates 1.7 gigawatts of electricity, most of it for your NSA guys and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory." We crossed over a bridge, and now I could see the entire structure. "How tall are those things?" I asked. "Just over 1,000 feet, he said, "taller than the Eiffel Tower." As I digested that, I suddenly realized that this was the longest conversation that Henry and I had held the entire trip. "How come you know so much about all this?" I asked. He glanced over at me. "I grew up around these parts," he said. Then he abruptly pulled off the interstate onto State Route 58 and headed north toward Oak Ridge. Shortly afterwards, he turned into the parking lot of a roadside motel. "Too late to go visiting tonight," he said. "We'll stay here." He caught my skeptical look. "Don't worry. The rooms are small, but they're clean," he said. Great, I thought. A terrible day just got a little worse. Actually, the motel turned out to be more comfortable than I expected, and the breakfast they served the next morning was delicious. I'd never had grits before, but to my surprise I liked them. Afterwards, we got back in the car and made our way to the gates of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Even though we were on their approved visitors list, the security was still very thorough. The NSA's operation at Oak Ridge goes by the less-than-descriptive name of the Multi-Program Research Facility, but everybody there just calls it Building 5300. The team at Building 5300 works primarily on code breaking. In today's world, that means throwing maximum computing power at encrypted data until it whines like a puppy and gives up its secrets. My specialty is different. I try to analyze computer software of unknown origin and either eradicate or neutralize it. The Oak Ridge boys and girls specialize in decryption, so I hadn't had much to do with them in the past. But once they began showing me their toys, ideas began to flow. In a nutshell, Building 5300 houses what may well be the world's largest and fastest computer. It's so massive that it fills an area the size of a warehouse and requires a tremendous cooling capacity to keep it from frying itself. And did I mention fast? The current iteration of their baby is an exascale computer, which means it can perform 10 to the 18th power calculations per second. Even 128-bit encryption can't stand up to that. What intrigued me was the idea of turning that kind of power loose on viruses, worms, and Trojan horses. The hackers who write this stuff have their own style, their own way of solving problems. It occurred to me that it might be possible to identify who wrote a piece of malware by the way they wrote the code. I get it. Kind of like a linguist can tell where a text comes from and when it was written by the choice of words, spellings, and phrases, the head techie said excitedly. All we'd need would be enough samples so we could identify patterns and tendencies. I was pretty pleased with myself at that idea and vowed to present it to my boss as soon as I got back to Fort Meade. Businesses and governments were coming under increasing numbers of cyber attacks. This might be a way to identify who had launched the attack and where it had come from. About that time, I heard a grunt from behind me, and I turned around to see Henry looking at his watch. He'd been patiently and silently following me all day, and now he was not so subtly letting me know that it was quitting time. I checked my phone and was surprised to realize just how late it had gotten. That evening, Henry drove me into the city of Oak Ridge and took me to Dean's restaurant for dinner. The place wasn't much to look at, a converted pharmacy, but the fried catfish Henry ordered was delicious. I might turn into a Southerner if everything is this good, I told him. He just snorted. When I got back to my room at the motel, I turned on my cell phone and discovered that I had a voicemail from Ginny. My sudden business trip was unusual, and she was both surprised and annoyed, especially since I hadn't told her when I'd be back. I guess I'm making it hard for her to arrange her next liaison with Amir, I thought bitterly, and started to erase her message. Instead, I replayed it so I could listen to her voice more closely. It was strange. Her voice sounded like it always did, but I couldn't stop hearing the lascivious tone she'd used with her lover. How could she be so recognizable and so unfamiliar at the same time? Finally, I shut off the phone and flopped back on the bed. As I lay there, scenes from our life together kept flashing through my mind. Suddenly, I recalled the time Ginny had come home all upset because her best friend had caught her husband cheating. I told her to kick that bum out and then find a hired gun lawyer to take him to the cleaners, she said vengefully. If he didn't want to stay married, he could at least have filed for divorce. He didn't have to cheat. Although I had agreed with Ginny's assessment, I'd been somewhat surprised at her vehement reaction. But at least I was reassured about my own marriage because it was obvious that Ginny would never cheat on me. What a fool you were. I cursed myself. What a hypocrite she is. After breakfast, I was scheduled to take a tour of the Y-12 complex. That, of course, is where they made the bomb, and it's in a different area of the reservation. I never realized how big the Oak Ridge Reservation is. Henry drove me through rolling hills and woodlands that were uninhabited, and suddenly we came upon an industrial complex the size of a small town. At Building 5300, I was among people from my own agency, and we could talk shop. At Y-12, I was just another visiting fireman, and it didn't take long for me to see that my guide thought I was a waste of his time. For that matter, I felt the same way. I understood that my boss wanted me out of the way so I wouldn't tip off Ginny and Amir that we were onto them. But surely I could be doing something more interesting than wandering around a highly classified nuclear weapons manufacturing facility. Besides, I hated nukes and didn't want to be any nearer to them than was absolutely necessary. So when noon rolled around, I sidled over to Henry and asked him if there wasn't something else we could do rather than traipse after my bored tour guide. Henry's face actually reconfigured itself into an expression I thought might be a smile. We made our excuses to my guide and Henry led me out to the car, and off to another local eatery outside the reservation. Over lunch, I asked him if there was anything to see in the area. For sure, he said. There's some pretty country about a half-hour drive from here, if you're willing to get off the main roads. That sounded good to me. At that point, almost anything would have, so I eagerly agreed. Accordingly, after lunch, I found myself going west-northwest from Oak Ridge to Frozen Head State Park. When I asked Henry about the odd name, he told me it came from the main peak, which was often snow-covered in the colder months of the year. We were already traveling on an old state highway when we turned north toward the little town of Petros, where the park entrance is located. Once we got to the park, our car started climbing as the highway turned into a series of curves and switchbacks snaking their way up the side of Fork Mountain. The posted speed limit was 10 miles per hour, and given the icy conditions and the sharp curves, I thought even that was excessive. The park was mostly filled with deciduous trees, and with no foliage to block the view, the vistas were impressive. Henry kept pointing them out to me every time we came to an overlook, so perhaps that was why he didn't spot the SUV that overtook us and started to pass. Only it didn't pass us. It suddenly rammed into the side of our car. "Son of a b!" Henry yelled and yanked the wheel to the right, but the other vehicle came right with us and slammed into us again. As our tires went off the pavement, Henry fought the wheel, and for a second, I thought he was going to regain control. Then the world turned topsy-turvy as our car flipped and rolled. When the view through the windshield finally stabilized, we were on our back like a stranded turtle, and I was groggily hanging upside down, held in place by my seatbelt. Movement in front of us caught my eye, and I struggled to make sense of the upside-down view. After a moment, I saw the SUV that had sideswiped us pull into the entrance of a Jeep trail up ahead, then back up and turn around. "He's coming back to finish us off," I yelled. Henry was still cursing and struggling to free the big automatic he carried.